A close examination of the entire period from 1870 to 1970 reveals that predominantly administered pricing, i.e., unmediated accounting calculations, and cartelized practices were the rule. Such a framework, however, had begun to lose its effectiveness in the 1950s and 1960s, as proliferating market forces did overcome the Achnacarry networks of the International Petroleum Cartel, IPC. The 1928 Achnacarry Agreement inaugurated a new era of cartelization since the U.S. antitrust law of 1911, which had led to the breaking up of Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust. This was in response to the worldwide irreconcilable price wars that were in full swing at the time, when there was no adequately developed global oil, capitalist, structure that would objectively mediate and manage all this perpetual chaos into a forcible, regulating reconciliation. This time, the control of oil meant cartelization of oil under the tutelage of a leviathan, from ocean to ocean, across the entire geography of the world, minus the Soviet territory. Blair charmingly summarizes the 7 sacred tenets of this infamous agreement as follows. Alarmed by the rapidity with which the price war has spread from India to America and then back to Europe, the heads of the 3 dominant international majors met at Achnacarry Castle in Scotland to prevent the recurrence of such disturbances. Hello my friends, welcome to my Energy Economist channel. In this video we are going to talk about the stages of oil production, so stay with me. Walter C. Teague, then president of Exxon, Standard Oil of New Jersey, was quoted by a trade journal as saying, "Sir John Cadman, head of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, BP, and myself were guests of Sir Henri Deterding, head of the Royal Dutch Shell, and Lady Deterding at Achnacarry for the grouse shooting, and while the game was a primary object of the visit, the problem of the world's petroleum industry naturally came in for a great deal of discussion." Referred to generally as the As-Is Agreement of 1928 or the Achnacarry Agreement, the product of this discussion was a document, dated September 17, 1928, setting forth a set of 7 principles and outlining in general terms the policies and procedures to be followed in applying them. The principles provided for 1. Accepting and maintaining as their share of markets the status quo of each member. 2. Making existing facilities available to competitors on a favorable basis, but not at less than actual cost to the owner. 3. Adding new facilities only as actually needed to supply increased requirements of consumers. 4. Maintaining for each producing area the financial advantage of its geographical location. 5. Drawing supplies from the nearest producing area. 6. Preventing any surplus production in a given geographical area from upsetting the price structure in any other area. The last point asserted that the observance of these principles would benefit not only the industry but consumers as well. Given the necessity of tight control and awesome task of administration, the cartel had to issue several supplementary memoranda subsequent to the original agreement. Blair writes, "As the companies became increasingly familiar with the troublesome problems of trying to make a cartel operate successfully, the instructions had to cover a growing number of issues and at the same time become increasingly specific and precise. The principal topics with which they dealt were A. Fixing quotas, B. Making adjustments for under and over trading, C. Fixing prices and other conditions of sale, and D. Dealing with outsiders. The first stage in the development of the Middle Eastern oil industry coincided with the rudimentary development of capitalism and absence of full-fledged modern landed property. The private ownership of land excluded the ownership of subsoil, including the ownership of minerals underneath. A typical oil concession included the surrender of the right to explore, develop, and produce oil, natural gas, and related substances to the concessionaire, an international oil company. And from both legal and theoretical standpoints, this surrender of the right to explore, develop, and produce should not be confused with the surrender of ownership of the resource, i.e., oil deposits in place, to the contracting oil companies. The term concession, rather than lease, refers to a contract between a private entity, i.e., a company, and a government, i.e., a would-be sovereign entity. The oil concessions during this first stage, 1901 to 50, had more or less the following commonalities. 1. They nearly covered the entire subsurface of the land in a country or territory. 2. They had a long duration that normally extended beyond 50 or 60 years. 3. They were only a handful of cartelized concessionaires worldwide. 4. The terms of the concessions were uniform. 5. The principal financial obligation was the uniform payment of royalty. 6. The financial terms were extremely moderate. 7. There was little change in the terms and conditions of these concessions. The laws of the oil concessions, i.e., the colonial contracts governing the dominated oil regions of the world, including the Middle East, are substantially different from the leasing contracts that prevail in the United States. It should be noted that the essential characteristic of the U.S. leasing practices stems from the structure of ownership of the subsoil, which is included as a part of the ownership of land. Due to the observance of the rule of capture, in the United States, the materials obtained from the subsoil belong to the owner of the land. Thus, from the beginning, capital investments in exploration, development, and production of oil had to come to terms with two separate systems of landed property in the subsurface across the globe. At the same time, from the standpoint of the stage of development, there emerged the tendency to a rudimentary valorization of landed property in these territories as opposed to a full-blown valorization in the United States. Valorization of the landed property leads to the formation of rent as a category, which in turn depends on the prior establishment of capitalism and capital as a social relation. That is why the industry as a whole, a disorderly conflation of different social relations in colonial and semi-colonial settings, had to be managed by direct control and crude and unmediated cost and price calculations. Basing point accounting, which is illustrated in a bit of detail in the chapter on OPEC, was essentially the main springboard of pricing in the period. The second stage in the development of the Middle Eastern oil industry was the gradual objectification of market forces that eventually led to decartelization and abandonment of administered pricing of oil through the crisis of 1973–74. This stage saw the uneasy coexistence of the declining cartelized mechanisms and practices, and the rising proliferation of market forces that carried and conveyed the spread of competition against the pre-arranged production, captive oil concessions, gentlemen's agreements, and arbitrary accounting of oil royalties and rents, according to fictitious posted pricing. Any transitional period, by necessity, tends to portray the amalgam of the vanishing past and the emerging future. The breakdown of the cartelization of oil was the consequence of certain evolutionary changes beyond the cartel's surrogate allocation and accounting system that had long been skillfully employed across the vast, untouched, and presumably passive geography of production. In one important sense, in contrast to its American counterpart, the history of the cartelization of international oil is a remarkable story of primitive accumulation. The cartelization of oil is indeed a prehistory of germinating capitalist social relations in these regions of the world, a prehistory of capital. Therefore, it would be a partial assessment if the focus of the analysis were to be merely on imperialism and outright plundering in this period. In addition to a more palpable issue of nationalism, the question of class that is often out of sight and lurking beneath all these occurrences must be taken into account in itself and as a prerequisite for organic unity of oil and globalization, and thus the relevance of the law of value in the coming years. These two issues, although inseparable at the time, must be analytically dissected for the sake of the evolution of capitalism as an ultimate trump card and as a durable social relation, and the identity of imperialism as an unambiguous and identifiable period, i.e., a specific epoch, in the development of the former. The transition in this second stage shows that the spread of capitalist social relations, via oil, was not only contradictory but also contagious. Historically, however, the triumph of cartelization sowed the seeds of its own destruction. Introduction of foreign capital in the exploration, development, and production of oil and the germinating capitalist social relations in many of these oil territories have eventually led to the valorization of landed property under capitalism. Therefore, this transitional stage is the beginning of the unraveling and dismantling of the ad hoc and fragmented accounting schemes that stitched the U.S. oil basing point system at the Gulf of Mexico to the newly devised, i.e., the cut rate, posted prices at the Persian Gulf. This provided the companies with an opportunity to pocket not only the monopoly oil profits but also the lion's share of the oil royalties. Toward the end of the 1960s, there occurred, inter alia, three major developments that entirely undermined the cartelized character of the industry in favor of the rising objective market forces and spot oil prices globally. First, there appeared transformative macroeconomic changes in OPEC's relationship with the IPC. This was reflective of changes in the internal development and potential integration of the oil exporting countries into the world economy. Second, there emerged the proliferation of independent oil companies, which is a telling story about the internal turmoil and erosion of power in the cartelized system of Achnacarry, 1928-72. This was a grand experiment on the so-called barriers to entry, and in retrospect it was settled unilaterally by the eventual collapse of the IPC in 1972. To identify some of these independents, names such as Ashland Oil, Occidental Petroleum, Amerada Hess, Marathon Oil, Continental Oil, City Service, Sun Oil, Union Oil, Phillips Petroleum, and Getty Oil come to mind. Finally, there was a considerable increase in the exploration and development costs of U.S. domestic oil, the costliest in the world, in both per/barrel and absolute magnitude. Eventually, the grand cartelized network of Achnacarry was unraveled piece by piece during the transition period. The gentleman's agreement gave way to the tumultuous forces of the market. The lack of control over the increasing volume of oil outside of the cartel's network did the trick. The development of adequate capitalist structure in the oil exporting countries led to de facto valorization of landed property in oil. This in turn transformed the nature of OPEC, notwithstanding the Trojan horses of the golden years of Pax Americana within OPEC that desperately searched for a middle ground. The U.S. domestic oil fields were rationalized, the global oil industry was reorganized and unified through the crisis, and the price of production of the U.S. oil had become the regulating price of production for the entire industry worldwide. The world oil entered into the era of globalization with unified market prices, global differential oil rents, and plenty of volatility. The era of cheap oil/expensive oil was over. The law of one price, underpinned by regulating capital in the U.S. domestic oil, had become a universal rule for all oil across the board. Yet, in realpolitik, the deception of national security, via the allegation of dependency and demand for access, led to tough talks and threats against Pax Americana's favorite son, the Shah of Iran, by Henry Kissinger, and to the panic plan of a rapid deployment force by the Carter administration. On the supposedly analytic front, the post-1970s geopolitics of oil had essentially centered on the traditionally fragmented quarrels over the de-Americanization ate of oil and concern over U.S. domestic oil production, consumption, and imports. And it took nearly another decade for the United States, OPEC, and the emerging world to realize that ultimately these epochal changes were irreversible. Decartelization of oil also cut the umbilical cord of the U.S. foreign policy from oil. The IPC was in a variety of ways a beachhead with multiple economic and political outposts in the oil-producing countries. The companies within the IPC often operated as a government within a government in many of these countries. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Iran was a notorious class by itself in this regard. This was probably as important, if not more, as the economic aspect of oil, particularly for the United States. If you want to learn more about the stages of oil production, you could do so in my book, Economics of Oil and Gas Production, which is published on Amazon. Check it out at the link in the description. Please take a second to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and do not forget to also hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching and goodbye.